Good morning, everyone, and welcome to GPPAC Peace Education webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today and for your interest. My name is Kristina Miletic. I coordinate Western Balkans and the Sub-Saharan African regions at GPPAC, and I'm also liaison person for GPPAC Peace Education Working Group, and GPPAC stands for Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. Before we get started, I would like to introduce you GPPAC for those of you who are not familiar with our work, and then to introduce you our expert of today, Dr. Gary Shaw. Let me just see. Okay. GPPAC was founded in 2003 as a member-led network of civil society organizations active in the field of conflict prevention and peace building across the world. Our mission is to promote a shift in how the armed conflict is dealt with, a shift from reaction to prevention of armed conflict. And how we do so, we work together with our members and we focus on the bottom-up approach and what our local members do and need. So really to support their local activities and their need. We have 15 regional networks or local organizations, as you could see on this map. And together with our members, we try to prevent a conflict. And we focus on different topics such as human security, gender, dialogue and mediation, and one of them is peace education. Since 2006, GPPAC members from all corners of the world have been working together to exchange information, knowledge, skills, and strategies on how best to engage and to collaborate with key stakeholders in their education systems. Our members have formed the Peace Education Working Group. It is a very unique working group, bringing together civil society organizations, teachers, academia, and representatives of ministries of education, as you could see also among our participants today, or other relevant government agencies to build the capacity of peace educators, teachers, and civil society organizations to integrate peace education in national curricula, teacher training, and education that is related to policies and recommendations. And we organize one webinar planned every month where our members, experts, are sharing their lessons learned and expertise with you. And I'm glad that we have today with us Dr. Gary Shaw, who is the chair of the Peace Education Working Group, and he will provide an overview of some key concepts and approaches and practical strategies for developing intercultural capability in schools. Let me introduce you, Dr. Gary Shaw. He has, so as I mentioned, he has been member of the GPPAC Peace Education Working Group for more than a decade and has extensive experience in presenting peace education related initiatives to national and international audiences. He began his career as a secondary teacher, and currently he works in the education sector of the Victorian Public Service, where he manages overseas immersion programs for middle year secondary students. Gary has been involved in research related to school improvement, student well-being, community development as a research fellow at the University of Melbourne. He has a master's degree in education, restorative practices in schools, and a PhD in which the focus of his thesis was actually the development of interculturality in schools. So welcome to Gary. And before I give the floor to Gary, just to let you know that if you have any questions, you can ask them via chat during the presentation, and then we will read them after the presentation, or you can raise a hand. And just for the end, this is a picture of our face-to-face meeting 2 years ago. So now I would like to give a floor to Gary. Thank you very much.
Oops. Sorry, Christina, I'm just sharing the screen. What can people see there?
The first slide, developing intercultural capability in schools.
Oh, okay, so people can see that.
Yes.
Okay. So I can't see anything like that on my screen, I'm sorry to say. Is there any way I can see my screen?
You should be able when...
Ah, that's better
Yes,
now.
yeah, okay.
Okay. Oh, look, thank you very much for that introduction, Christina, and thank you also for everybody joining in tonight. We're very proud of the work we've been doing in the Peace Education Working Group for more than a decade. And these series of peace education seminars provide a really important opportunity for us to share our experience and knowledge more broadly. I'm coming to you from the Southern Hemisphere, where it's just after 6 p.m. in the evening. Thanks you to all of those who joined us from around the world, including, as I understand it, some of my colleagues from the Department of Education and Training. And I also want to give a special shout out to anybody who's joined us from the United States, because I think it might be something like 4 o'clock in the morning there. So thank you for joining in. What I'd first of all like to do is just give you an overview of the webinar. What I'll do overall is to look at some key concepts, approaches, and practical strategies. But first of all, I have to start with COVID-19. I don't think we can do anything but. It's obviously something that's consuming everybody at the moment. It's a global issue, and like so much of our lives today, everything is interconnected globally through technology, trade, migration, the environment. This is part of the reason that I'm taking a global perspective and approach. It's so important nowadays. I'll primarily do this through global citizenship education to discuss how intercultural capability might be developed in schools. And intercultural capability is one of the key drivers in our work at the Department of Education, and we focus on global learning and engagement. As you can see from the name of the slide, that's essentially the driver of a lot of the things that I'm doing in the department at the moment. We'll also look at conflict resolution and peace educations, as well as global citizenship, as well as intercultural capability as part of global citizenship development. I want to explore some key concepts and perspectives as they relate to culture and intercultural capability, and also then to look at some of the initiatives that the Department of Education and Training is using to support schools in the development of intercultural capability. And finally, what I'll do is I'll share some of my own research and provide some resource links and references that people can then use. My apologies in advance that I've actually I've used more text than I normally would, but normally you'd present live to an audience and then would have the chance to engage more with people during the presentation. So what I'm doing today is just providing enough information for you to have a look after the session at various ideas and resources and links that I'm providing. I just want to locate myself in the world for a moment. Most of you be aware of where Australia is. It's a federation of 6 states and 2 territories. The states and territories manage the schooling system, made up of government, independent and faith-based schools, mostly Catholic schools, and they do so through a mix of federal and state funding. The population of Australia is currently just on 25.5 million, and Victoria, where I come from, right down in the bottom part, the southern part, is in Melbourne, and the population of Victoria is around 6.5 million, and we are quite a multicultural state in a multicultural country. People come from about 200 countries, speak more than 260 languages, follow about 130 faiths. In the last census, 49.1% of people were born overseas or born in Australia with at least one parent who had been born overseas. This was up from 43.6% in 2006. An estimated 4,000 refugees settle in Victoria each year, and approximately 100 asylum seekers live in Victorian community on bridging visas while they wait for determination. So there's quite a lot of diversity, and cultural and ethnic diversity is a characteristic of most Australian schools and a key focus of education policy and curriculum. I also have to start by acknowledging Indigenous Australians, who make up 3% of the population, as part of our diversity. I know you can't really see this map, but it just gives you a sense of the diversity that already existed in Australia before white settlement. The colours represent tribal groups and languages at the time of white settlement. And so it was estimated there are about 500 different tribal groups and languages in Australia at that time. When holding meetings in Victoria, it's customary to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. And in the spirit of intercultural capability, I'm presenting on Wathaurong land, and I wish to acknowledge the Indigenous custodianship of the land by Indigenous people and their elders past, present and emerging. So, the global context in which we're now situated. COVID-19, a global issue with extraordinary health and social and economic consequences. The experience of China, Italy, Spain, the United States is pretty grim and confronting from where I would sit. But elsewhere in the world, it's been such a shattering and transformative experience. I'd like to wish all our colleagues and friends all the best wherever you are in the world and at this very difficult time. Hopefully the collective and collaborative efforts of scientists and medical experts around the world can bring the pandemic under control. But of course things will never be the same as they were before COVID-19, I think. The economic and health benefits are far-reaching. The social impacts are starting to emerge through lockdowns, social distancing, and a reduction in individual rights, and expectations that if we all do the right thing for the collective good, things will improve. I noticed just yesterday, children in Spain were allowed outside for the first time in 6 weeks. This would have been hard to imagine at the beginning of 2020. For my part, my colleagues and I are entering our sixth week of working from home. Victorian students are learning online, and schools are only open for students and emergency workers and those who have additional risks in their home situations. Around Australia, school systems are responding differently, but essentially schools are operating on an online environment, but the expectation is that schools will return face-to-face learning in the near future. For Victoria, that may well be at the end of second term, which is into June. Now, Australia's fared comparatively well in terms of COVID-19, with just 6,700 confirmed cases and as I understand it, about 83 deaths nationally. The lockdown in some form or other is expected to last for many months. And of course, the shutdown of many public facing business and organisations has resulted in massive job losses and significant economic challenges. In terms of some of the impacts in the social spaces, there has been a rise in particular types of anti-Asian sentiment, a rise in border control, or a sense that we are in a situation where we have to close our borders and keep others out. This, I think, is playing out in terms of fear of the other and fear of foreigners. And I think that's will have a lasting effect beyond the resumption of normal schooling and the resumption of other aspects of normal life. I think we also have to acknowledge that what COVID-19 has done is made visible the extraordinary courage and bravery of health professionals and other frontline workers, and the capacity of people to reach out to others around the world. It has created global expressions of solidarity and inspiration, which is just a wonderful thing to see. And the other thing that it's doing, obviously, and this is one of those global responses, it's the collaboration of medical scientists and professionals around the world to work together to develop a cure, or to share resources, or to help each other out. And that, I think, is one of the ideals of global citizenship, and something that we would hope to see beyond the pandemic. So I'd like to suggest that the key approach for schooling in response to the pandemic now and the future is through a focus on global citizenship. This is no doubt a contested idea, because the concept of global citizenship itself is contested, and as I understand, not everybody would subscribe to the idea of being a global citizenship. However, I would maintain that it's very hard to maintain an isolationist perspective in a globalised world that we currently live in. Now, preparing and supporting schools in providing constructive, positive, inclusive learning environment in this context is critically important now and in the future. The mission and values of schools and teachers that I've worked with for over 40 years have been clearly focused on provision of supportive and positive learning environments for all students. Schools can provide opportunities to stand up against division and promote discrimination, and provide effective learning, an effective learning place which is inclusive and free from prejudice. So the idea that global citizenship can develop responsible citizens at a local and a global level is now, I think, more important than it ever has been. Now, a global citizen is someone who is aware of and who can make sense of the wider world. They can take an active role in their community and work with others to make the planet more equal, fair and sustainable. A good example of this has been the youth-led environmental campaigns over the last couple of years that have stood up against politicians and challenged the status quo. They are great examples of acting locally but thinking globally. Obviously, global citizenship doesn't entail legal status. It refers more to a sense of belonging. to the global community and a common humanity, which presumes its members are experiencing solidarity and collective identity amongst themselves and a collective responsibility for some of the challenges and issues that we face, most commonly environmental ones today. But as we've now realised, things like pandemics and the effect that it has on trade and other aspects of our lives. The Sustainability Development Goals direct us fairly clearly towards global citizenship, particularly through SDG 4, which seeks to ensure sustainable development, which seeks to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education, lifelong learning. This is particularly the target in target 4.7, which really does focus on the importance of global citizenship and cultural an appreciation of cultural diversity. In Victoria, we operationalise this through what's known as the Framework for Improving Student Outcomes. There is a link there to global citizenship in Victorian schools, and it'll take you to the continuum of practice for school improvement, which is designed to improve principals and teachers to identify areas of practice that can be developed and improved. And it describes 4 proficiency levels, from emerging through to excelling. And one of the dimensions in FISOs is global citizenship, which is made up of 5 intersecting components. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll focus on 2, valuing conflict resolution and peace, and developing intercultural capability. Just by way of example, the first one is the continual practice for valuing conflict resolution and peace. These practices are obviously ideals. Nothing is so linear or clear cut, but this will give you an idea of the sort of transitions that schools may go through in terms of developing conflict resolution and peace within the curriculum or within the broader school community. Intercultural capability similarly is within the FISO. I'll just go directly to the expectations for students in terms of intercultural capability. Students who are interculturally capable are curious about the world, open-minded to diversity and benefits, empathetic and compassionate, critical thinkers who examine and reflect on and challenge assumptions, stereotypes and prejudices. And these skills, attributes and underlying values inform the respectful relationships they have with others. So basically, it's about people who may have different understandings, backgrounds, commitments, but who can still come together, engage, interact, collaborate and get along. And this is essentially what schools are all striving for, this idea that an effective learning environment is one which teachers and students can get along with each other despite their differences and their diversity. I just want to briefly touch on the concept of culture and identity. I think it's important, particularly in terms of teachers, to consider and think about the concepts that are being taught through intercultural capability. And it's important for teachers themselves to have a good understanding of the concepts and to also be interculturally capable in their own right. So as a social construct, the concept of culture is difficult to define. This is partly due to the fluid nature of the concept. Culture is not fixed, but it's a dynamic process. It can be reflected in multiple affiliations, subcultures and identities, and in a range of ways. And it's also traditionally bound up with the concept of distinction, that is a way of ranking and differentiating people. So people like Dervin and Abdullah Paselau offer some interesting perspectives on the concept of culture, this idea that having culture actually needs to be compared with other cultures, which in turn does promote perception of difference, ethnocentrism. It's about cultures being differentiated in terms of as better than ours, superior. It can lead to power imbalances, prejudice and racism, particularly if culture is used to rid the other of his or her plurality or identity. And, you know, in multicultural Australia, this is such an important kind of concept. Culture is a significant factor in a lot of people's lives, and their abilities to maintain cultural plurality at the same time as sharing in the cultures of other people is a significant investment, a significant objective of a lot of the work we do in terms of social cohesion. So obviously, as I've raised earlier, racism has become something that's it's arisen out of the COVID-19, or it's been made more visible by COVID-19, particularly in an anti-Asian kind of way. A number of people with an Asian background, and obviously Asia consists of numerous countries, but people who of Asian appearance have been attacked or been made feel unwelcome, and there's been some violence as well, which is hardly what you hope to see, but we do have to manage and deal with it. Obviously, racism can take many forms, such as jokes or comments, but it can be, you know, quite serious. One of the things that we need to identify is that for many schools, teachers have difficulty responding to racist behaviour, and this is an obvious concern. And one of the ways we're trying to address that is through the intercultural capability in both the curriculum and through things like FISO. We know that naming and actively challenging racism through education and other forms of injustice is a critical strategy. It's just a photograph that I took in a school where it was largely made up of newly arrived refugees, around 95%, mostly from the Horn of Africa. Needless to say that central to the work of that school was developing and fostering positive relationships among the students and developing intercultural capability across the school, particularly through the community, as well as the teachers and students. I'd just like to touch very briefly on what we're doing in Victorian schooling. Intercultural capability, along with personal and social skills, ethical capability, critical creative thinking are mandated across the Victorian curriculum in all learning areas. And whilst they're mandated, it doesn't mean necessarily they're going to be taught, but the expectation is that teachers infuse their learning with these capabilities. The focus of a lot of our work in the International Education Division where I work is the is intercultural capability. We work with the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority, who manage the Victorian curriculum, and they've recently developed an intercultural assessment tool that if you click onto that link, you should be able to access. Now, in the department, we also focus on global citizenship, which we recognise can contribute to social cohesion in Victorian communities. There are a number of programs that we are responsible for that basically facilitate intercultural capability. The Victorian Young Leaders Program, there's one of the ones that I have involvement in, which is an overseas immersion program for students who go to India, Indonesia and China. Obviously that program's been deferred at the moment, and hopefully we can get that started in the latter part of this year or early next year. Intercultural Champions is a professional learning program for teachers, and if you click on that link there, what you'll go to is a whole range of lessons that the teachers who have been involved in the professional learning program have developed to support intercultural learning in the classroom. And we have other programs for principals, for diaspora communities, and there are case studies and other work that we are responsible for. And we support schools in through these initiatives to not only develop intercultural capability or global citizenship, but to the other capabilities such as the personal and social capability, ethical capability, and creative and critical thinking. This then brings me to the some of the factors that will facilitate intercultural capability in schools and some examples of practice. Again, there's a lot of text on the screen, but I've given some links to some research, and you'll find those at the end of the presentation. But I just want to point out some of the examples of practices that are important in developing intercultural capability. These are split into 5 key areas, and the first one relates to leadership in the school and what principals and school administrators can do in helping or supporting or facilitating or leading intercultural capability. But essentially, the adoption of a whole school mindset and an intersectorial approach. Intercultural education doesn't just it doesn't exist in isolation from other dimensions of school practice. It needs to be connected and supported through other things that are going on in the school. And part of the work is to have a shared and common vision and values that support the underpinning behaviours that you'd expect to see through intercultural capability. As mentioned before, things like open-mindedness, inclusion, curiosity, an openness and interest in the world. Leadership also would need to call out structural and social inequalities and be able to make them more visible in terms of school decision making. Another important one is to establish a local warrant for intercultural capability and founded on the idea of inclusion and social justice, the idea of moral purpose and common good. The idea of building a climate of conviviality, I really like that. I think it resonates very strongly with the kind of atmosphere I'd like to see in a school. In terms of teaching practice, it's a recognition that culture is a dynamic and socially constructed process. So culture can be co-constructed, and including child-centred, constructivist, inquiry-based learning pedagogies are particularly important in that notion of co-construction. So this, I think, is a particularly important one, knowing that each person brings to the classroom particular understandings, particular cultural understandings, particular cultural interests and beliefs. In a school environment or classroom environment that enables voices and inclusion to be heard and to be acknowledged is pretty important. And so I would highly recommend the development of curriculum that brings these sorts of things to the service, particularly through respect and compassion for others. Some other ideas there: avoid focusing on difference and assumptions about culture that leads to moralistic judgments, and reduce the foreigner other to a cultural deficit, the notion of an exotic depiction. I know in previous times where we focused a lot on multicultural education, it was often all about the other, about what does the foreigner bring to the classroom, rather than recognising that we all have culture, we all have a story, we all are part of the intercultural story of the classroom and of the school. In student learning, providing examples of, or providing opportunities of students to develop relationships and acknowledge each other before engaging them in complex and controversial issues is important. Look for those intercultural opportunities and moments. In Australia, where we have a very multicultural context, as I said, there are numerous opportunities inside and outside the classroom for intercultural encounters, and being able to learn from those encounters through classroom reflections and discussions is an interesting and productive opportunity. So I'll just go back one. Language learning also is a critical aspect of intercultural capability. One of my great disappointments in life is I haven't been able to properly learn another language. I would love to do it. I think it opens up so much more understanding about the language and the culture behind it. Professional learning for teachers is also critical, ongoing, targeted, providing targeted professional learning that brings teacher beliefs into view is really important. Beliefs matter, and they need to be discussed and challenged or contested, or particularly when things like values and vision are being developed in schools. It's important that different perspectives are brought into the discussion and managed and allowed visibility. Provide time and opportunity for teachers and principals to be critically reflexive, and develop educators' understanding of their own history, culture, power, prejudice. What people bring into the classroom is really important, and being able to understand that. For most teachers in Australia, they will have a migration story. They will be able to trace a history, a cultural history, and bringing that into the classroom can also be a very important process. One of the other things that we need to be able to do, I think, is research or provide an evidence base for the work we do. And this is no different for intercultural capability. I would recommend that an audit of practice so that we see what's missing, what's there, what we need to do more of or less of. Using student data to evaluate what's been taught and to continue to inform practices from an intercultural lens is also very important. So what I've tried to do is just, and I know I've done it very quickly, and I'm recognised that I wanted to allow time for questioning, and so I do apologise for rushing through some of that. We will be able to take questions in a moment. What I've done for you is to leave some resources that I think you'll find useful. Most of them have a very, very practical, provide lesson plans, provide ways of constructing curriculum. Many of them you will be familiar with. I will point out that Composer, which has recently been launched in the United States and now in Australia, is probably a really useful resource to have a look at, and it includes topics such as intercultural understanding, democracy, racism, news literacy, which I think is incredibly important right at the moment, and other lessons on social awareness. I've also tried to include all of the references that I've included in the presentation. So again, if you want to go back and have a look at those, then I think that would be would add value to your understanding of what I've said. So that kind of brings me to the end and allows, I think, around 15 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So what I'll do now is I'll stop sharing the screen, and we can hopefully have a really good discussion.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your such a rich and informative presentation. So I would like to, and I liked very much what you mentioned that related to interculturality, that we all have culture and story, and we are all part of the classroom of the school. I would like now to open the floor to the questions and comments, and you can ask the questions via chat, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand. Yes, there was also a question whether the presentation will be available. So the webinar has been recorded and it will be available on GPPAC website. But Gary, if you agree with it, we can also share your presentation with the participants.
Yeah, it's been designed to share, so I'm more than happy. And I've got some notes underneath the slides, which might be helpful as well.
Thank you. So we have our first question. Loretta, please go ahead.
Yes. Well, Gary, thank you very much. That was a very good presentation. We really learned quite a lot about, you know, your context, the work that you're doing. I just want to seek clarification because it's really, I found it very interesting, but I don't think I got the full information about the programs that you had mentioned, such as the Victorian Youth Leadership Program and the Intercultural Champions Program. I just want to clarify, is the leadership and coordination of these programs lodged in the Victorian Department of Education, or is it more a program that certain individual schools have what do you call this, have developed?
Thanks for the question, Loretta. My apologies if I didn't explain that well. I work in the International Education Division of the Department of Education and Training. This is a Victorian specific approach. The Victorian curriculum certainly has a strong focus on intercultural capability and also global learning. In the department, we manage a large number of initiatives that are designed to support the curriculum and to support teachers and schools in their work. And the Victorian Young Leaders Program is open to schools throughout Victoria. The Young Leaders to China has seen more than 1,800 Year 9 students travel and spend up to 6 weeks in places like China and Indonesia, 3 weeks in India, where they're really focused on development of leadership, as well as global citizenship and cultural capability. The Intercultural Champions involved around 39 teachers in 2 years of training, and the development of resources and lessons they could share in their local networks. The Building Global Citizenship program is principal-led, or it's involved principals who spend onshore and offshore time working out how to build global citizenship in their schools. And then we have a number of other projects with diaspora communities, in this particular case, Indian focus. But it's our job to try and help schools facilitate the idea of global learning and engagement in a really practical and authentic way.
Okay. So it is in the nature of something like an intercultural exchange. Is it? Yeah, that's my understanding, because you said there's a group of students from Victoria, and also like getting together with students from China, and so it's like that's the idea.
Yeah, they go basically and spend time in schools and universities in China, up to 6 weeks. There's been no reciprocal arrangement so far. In Indonesia, they spend 6 weeks in an Indonesian school. In India, they spend part of the time in the schools. And there was meant to be a reciprocal visit from the Indian students this year, but that's not going to happen now. So,
I just have one follow-up question. How is it funded? Because certainly that will involve, quite a lot of expense, no?
Yeah, it's a co-contribution model. So parents contribute around $3,000. Those that can afford it. For those that can't afford it, the government pays for the whole program, and the government then pays for the remainder of the program. So we fund up to 35% of places of students who wouldn't normally travel, who wouldn't have a passport or don't have a passport. So the government is committed to ensuring that anybody, regardless of the background or financial situation, is able to participate in the program.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Loretta.
Thank you, Loretta and Gary. I see that we have a next question from Tanya. So Tanya, please go ahead.
Sorry, Tanya, have you?
Tanya, we cannot hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can hear you now, Tanya.
I'm not sure that it was from me. Actually, I think that Biljana's profile is showing like Tatjana Popovic, but okay. In any case, I wanted to ask one question.
Yes, yes, it is mine.
Yeah. So Biljana, go ahead first, and then I will come later.
It is okay. You can ask, and then I will ask after you. That is okay.
Okay. I have a kind of follow-up question to Loretta's question. So, since we live in completely new world nowadays, how can we think of? I think that we need to think how to influence both schools, but even more importantly, decision makers, because we'll have to fight all these prejudices that you mentioned, Gary, and xenophobia actually, and they are becoming more and more important these days because people are going back into their tribes in a way, you know, so people feel scared. So particularly how to influence these decision makers to support such programs in schools, because we will stay a globally connected world. We cannot just cut off that. And I know that there are no definite answers, just you're thinking about that. Okay, thanks.
So I don't think we have to convince many people that racism or xenophobia or prejudice or discrimination is bad in Australia. I think there is some significant legislative arrangements in place. The education system is particularly dedicated towards social cohesion. So it's not difficult for us. What is difficult is equipping the teachers and schools to respond to the racism and the xenophobia that does occur at that level. It's unfortunate, but it is there. So I think the bigger challenge for us is providing the professional learning and the ability of teachers to support their students to stand up against racism when it occurs. We have within a lot of the program activity, you know, specific focus on student agency, giving students voice and confidence to be able to both understand as well as to understand and recognise when discrimination or prejudice is happening. So equipping teachers and students to be able to stand up and to confront those kind of things is kind of what we're focusing more of our energies on. I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's certainly the idea of agency and leadership for students and young people who will become our leaders of tomorrow, who will, you know, lead us in a very different world than the one we are today, and it will, as we've said throughout, be a very globalized world.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
I would like to give a floor to Bilja, and then we will address the questions from Gail and from Tracian.
Thank you, Christina. I just would like to thank Gary to this presentation, and for me it was very useful to hear those examples of practice, because they are more operative than all those principles, and I think they will be useful again when you pass once again through it and reflect on that a little bit more. So thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry if I missed something, but I am curious about this. Are there any activities which includes families, parents? Because as far as I understood, focus was on students, teachers, principals, diasporas, and schools. And do you have any actions, activities, programs, or something to include parents, because those students are going back home, and then if they if values in the families are not the same like in the school, then I think that they might be in a problem, especially depending on the age of students. So that's my question. Do you have any kind of this? Because I think it would be very useful. Just thank you, Gary, in advance.
It's an excellent question, Bilna. The hope is that the reach of our programs through teachers and principals and students is into the school communities in which the hope is intercultural capability is spread and developed. We know that the influence of the Young Leaders program, for example, does reach into families. Families are involved in the preparation of the students, and so we get some really positive feedback from families when the students return about the impact and influence of the program, and they also point out that it's opened their eyes and given them a greater insight into China or India or Indonesia. I think there's a bit of a gap in a direct focus on parents, whereas we do have some programs, including the Connecting Indian School Communities. That is one that we are particularly focused on families and parents, but there's not a lot of program activity specifically focused on parents. So we can only we hope that the reach of our programs is much broader than just the students themselves.
Thank you, Gary, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary and Bilio. So just following Tanya's question, I would like to, to read a comment from Tracy Ann. There is some economic modeling that has been done in Australia that estimates the cost of racism to the economy is roughly $38 billion. And he also shared the link via chat, so you can look at it. And now I would like to address the Gail's question. So she's saying, I'm curious if there is a separate subject in the curriculum that is dedicated to multicultural education or global citizenship, or is the concept integrated across the subjects?
The short answer is that it's integrated. The multicultural education or global citizenship or global learning may in fact be maybe a subject in some schools. In Australia, the schools have the autonomy to develop the curriculum based on basically the Australian and Victorian curriculum outline, and there are particular learning outcomes within that curricula, and schools are then at liberty to make amendments, adjustments. So it's not a syllabus as a set syllabus that has certain lessons at a certain time, but schools are open to include subjects or parts of the curriculum they think are most needed. It's usually context dependent, so it's about what these students need in this particular point in time. So sometimes you might see subjects such as global education, you might see multicultural education. The hope is that these areas are infused throughout the curriculum, that anything that's done in the school has a global outlook or a global perspective attached to it. Or if it was intercultural education, there would be a focus on inclusion, on enabling people to develop their understanding of different cultural perspectives, different beliefs, different commitments, and to demonstrate a willingness for people to work together despite their differences or their diversities. So thank you, Gail. I'm not sure that I've answered that, but if you go into the Australian curriculum or the Victorian curriculum is online. The assessment link that I gave to the intercultural capability give you a sense of how lessons might be taught with an intercultural capability focus.
Thank you, Gary. And we have time for one final question. I'm wondering if somebody would like or to write via chat or to raise a hand. Okay, there is a question from Tanya. How do you evaluate the impact of the educational program? Is it progressing?
Yes, it is progressing. There are different evaluation tools for different program activities. We're confident that the approach we're taking based on the evaluations we've undertaken so far is successful for the most part. There's always room for improvement. But I think overwhelmingly the impact of programs such as the Young Leaders and Intercultural Champions is a really positive one on their school communities. We have more to do on that.
Thank you, Gary. And once again, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation and sharing your expertise with us. And thank to all the participants who joined us today. As I mentioned before, we recorded the webinar and it will be available on our website, www.gpac.net. You can also share it with your contacts. And if you would like also to stay updated about our upcoming webinars, please check out our website. Thank you very much, and I wish you a lovely day.
Thanks, everybody. It's been lovely to have the chance to present to you.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much.
Do you want me to